Hello. Zystral here with Yellow Card TCG. Today, talking about Star Wars Unlimited. At the time of this video's recording and release, Star Wars Unlimited hasn't quite come out yet, but I figured I'd make this video a little bit ahead just to tell people about the game and get them introduced to the rules. For those of you who may know me or may not, I'm a pretty big fan of Star Wars and card games in general, so Star Wars Unlimited to me is the perfect combination of these hobbies. In this video, I'll be going over the basic rules and how to play. For those of you who may or may not know card games, we'll keep this straightforward and simple. This video will be designed for people who don't play card games, but I'll be including references to other TCGs throughout the video for those who do to make things a bit easier. Without further ado, let's jump straight into it. So like any other card game, Star Wars Unlimited is a simple multiplayer game, 2 players at least, but there are options to play with more than 2, like skirmishes and free-for-alls. And you play against your opponents, you play cards. The goal of Star Wars is to reduce your opponent's base's hit points to 0. We'll talk about what that means in a little bit. I think the best thing to start off with is getting used to cards. So there are a few different card types in Star Wars. You've got your leader, your base, units, events, and upgrades. Let's talk about the leaders and the bases first, since these are the ones that look a little bit different to the others. When you build a deck and you play a game of Star Wars Unlimited, you will have a leader and a base. These are not in your main deck, and they basically lead your deck and your army to victory. Your leader and your base function a bit like commanders in Magic the Gathering or leaders in One Piece. They are what defines your deck's identity and how your deck will play the game. So as we can see on the base cards, in the top left there's a big number there. That is your hit points. The base's hit points basically function as you, the player's hit points. So when this goes to 0, you lose the game. Your leader will have effects that you can use, and some additional other information that we'll talk about in a little bit later. But as you can see, they have their aspects, also known as colors, and their effects. We'll talk about what aspects means a little bit later when we talk about playing cards and deck building. But for now, know that the base and the leader determines your deck's identity, and your base is what controls your health. So let's look at the other cards, units, events, and upgrades. As you can see, they all look fairly similar. There's a few shared information and some unshared information. Let's take a quick look at the shared traits first. Every card has a name, every card has a type, which we can see along the top, and they all have a cost, which we can see along the left. Some cards will also have aspects underneath their cost icons. We again will talk about aspects and what this means a little bit later. And finally, most but not all cards will also have traits on them. Traits are kind of like types or subclasses, depending on what sort of game you play. For example, as you can see here, this particular card is an Imperial. Some cards may reference Imperials, some cards may reference Rebels, some cards may not reference anything at all, and you may be able to freely mix them. Just know that these are gameplay mechanics that some cards will look for or ask for. Now let's look at some of the unique aspects of each cards. Let's start with events. Events function just like spells in Magic or One Piece or any other card game you play. You play the card, you do the effect, and then it gets discarded. There's nothing major here, it's pretty much as you see, very straightforward. Then let's take a look at units. Units will make up the bulk of your gameplay and army. When you play a unit, it comes into the field, and it will then be able to attack and push your advantage and strategy. Units are separated into 2 categories, space and ground, which you can see along the top. We'll talk about what that means a little bit later. Additionally, just like with every other card, units will have their traits and their abilities. One thing that units have that other cards don't have are stats. The red number is the unit's power. This is how much damage it deals during battle. The number in blue is the unit's hit points. This is how much damage it can take before it's defeated. You'll notice that the icon for a unit's hit points is the same as the icon for your base's hit points. This makes it pretty easy to track defense. We'll talk about combat and what these means a little bit later. Lastly, there are upgrades. Upgrades, when played, attach themselves to a unit and give that unit an increase in stats and sometimes have their own effects. They're pretty straightforward, so when you attach a unit, the power goes up by the upgrade's power, and the HP goes up by the upgrade's HP. So now that we've explained the card types, let's explain the board. As you can see, the gameplay board is split into two sides. You've got your base and leader in the middle, and then on the left and the right, you have the ground area and the space area. Very fitting for a game like Star Wars. You have your TIE fighters and your X-Wings, and then you've got like stormtroopers and everyone else. As would make logical sense, units in the ground area can only interact with units in the ground area. Likewise, space area units can only interact with space area units. Sometimes there are effects that say this unit deals damage to anything, in which case ground units can damage space units, but for the purposes of attacking, they can only attack across the same board or your opponent's base. It's also worth mentioning here that all units will come into play rested or exhausted, but we'll discuss that a little bit later. Along the bottom, you also have resources. This is one of the main gameplay mechanics of Star Wars. It's very similar to Lorcana or Duel Masters, where you'll put cards from your hand into your resources as the game goes on. But we'll talk about that during the turns. So, as you can imagine, resources are used to pay the costs to play cards, you'll play units onto the board, you'll play events which will have effects, and you'll take it in turns to attack each other's bases, reducing it to 0. So now let's talk about the main selling point of Star Wars Unlimited. In my opinion, what makes Star Wars really stand out to other TCGs is how the turns are structured. In most other card games like Pokemon, or Magic, or Vanguard, or Weiss Schwarz, you're just sitting there watching your opponent make decisions and play the game, and then during your turn, your opponent is watching you make decisions and play the game. In Star Wars Unlimited, turns are shared, which is why we call them phases, to avoid confusion. So during a phase, both players will in turn take actions. During each player's opportunity to have an action during a phase, there are 5 actions you can take. You can play a card, declare an attack, use an action ability, pass, or claim the initiative. Let's talk about what each one of those means. Playing a card is pretty straightforward. If it's in your hand, you pay the resource cost indicated by the number on the top left, and if it's a unit, it comes into play. If it's an event, it happens. Let's now talk about the aspects. This is where a big part of the game's deck building and flexibility. Unlike other games like Commander or One Piece, where you cannot play cards outside of your deck's identity, in Star Wars, you're free to mix and match cards as you like. The limiting factor here is the card's aspect penalty. If your leader and base combined do not have the aspects shown on the card you're trying to play, then that card will cost 2 more resources for each aspect that you don't have represented in your leader and base. This means you could be playing a Darth Vader deck and still be playing Rebel cards. You just have to pay the cost for it. The next action is declaring an attack. This is pretty straightforward, and those of you who are used to Hearthstone or Shadowverse will understand this pretty easily. To declare an attack with a unit, you choose the standing unit or the readied unit you want to attack with, then you choose the target you want to attack, exhaust your attacking unit, and the unit you're attacking with deals damage equal to its power to whatever it is it's attacking. If units are attacking other units, the defending unit also deals its power back to the attacker. This happens simultaneously unless an effect says otherwise. Just like in Shadowverse and Hearthstone, and unlike in Magic, damage is permanent. You can attack as many times as you like during a turn, and you don't have to attack if you don't want to. Some effects may tell you to declare an attack as part of the effect, in which case you can only attack with a readied unit, and unlike in Magic, you attack 1 unit at a time. There's also no dedicated attack phase like there is in Yu-Gi-Oh!, meaning that you can attack with 1 unit, play some other cards, and then attack with another unit later, or you can weave attacks in between your gameplay. This is another element of strategy that I really like. Let's look at the next thing you can do, which is activate an action effect. So some cards will have abilities. Those abilities will be continuous, triggered effects. Like most card games, it's pretty intuitive to tell what type of an effect something is, but the easy way to tell whether or not something is an action effect in Star Wars is it will say action on the front in bold. This means that during your turn, you can pay the cost listed in the brackets to do the effect. It's almost like the unit is playing its own event in a way. Again, some effects will tell you to play cards or declare attacks, in which case that will all come under one action, and you must be able to do the requirements, i.e. attacking with a readied unit or paying the cost of the card you're going to play. There are a special subtype of actions called epic actions. These are once per game and are usually found on your base and leader. Note that epic actions being once per game is per card. That means that if you use your base's epic action, you can also use your leader's epic action. Using your leader's epic action doesn't stop you from using your base's epic action. Generally, the leader's epic action will be to deploy it as a unit, which is usually very powerful, but again, it being only once per game means that you have to think very carefully about how and when you use these effects. The next type of action you can take is pass. You can just choose to take no action if you so wish. Maybe your opponent is doing many things and you want to respond, or you have nothing you can do and you just want to watch what they're doing. This is an okay choice, and it can be strategically very powerful. Be aware, however, that if you pass, and then your opponent passes or your opponent claims the initiative, the current phase will end and we'll move to the cleanup step. So passing can be useful, but passing too much is a risk. Lastly is taking the initiative. I've mentioned this before once or twice, but this is another aspect where the sequential shared turns aspect of Star Wars becomes really exciting. When you take the initiative, you are passing for the rest of the turn. You get this little counter to say that you have the initiative, and now you might be wondering, well, what benefit is there to this? When you have the initiative, during the next phase, you get to take the first action. So at the start of a phase, if I have the initiative, I get to play a card or make an attack before my opponent can do anything. Likewise, if my opponent has the initiative, they can take an action before I do. This can be very powerful because some actions can be responsive, such as removing your opponent's units from the board or playing a big scary threat without danger of it getting removed straight away. Now, the one downside to taking the initiative is that once you've taken the initiative, your opponent is free to take as many actions as they want, because you're considered to be passing for the rest of the turn. Generally, initiative will usually be taken when you have no more actions you can do, but there are strategic reasons to taking the initiative early despite still having actions, because you want to deny your opponent of the initiative. This is another aspect of where the strategy in Star Wars Unlimited is really deep and interesting and complex. So throughout a phase, players will take it in turns to take one of these actions, and then once both players have passed or taken the initiative, they will proceed to the next phase via the resource step. In the resource step, both players will reset and get ready for the next phase. In this, both players take the following actions in this order. We'll draw 2 cards, then optionally put a card from hand into the resource area face down, and finally, all of their cards will be readied. This includes resources, units, and leaders. Readying until the end signifies to your opponent that you are ready to begin the next phase. One more thing to mention about taking the initiative: once you've claimed the initiative for a turn, the other player cannot claim the initiative that phase. They will be forced to pass in order to proceed to the next phase. One final tidbit to mention, because I know that people who play other card games will be interested: reducing your opponent's base to a 0 HP is the only way of winning the game. There is no deck out rule in this game, there is simply a fatigue mechanic, which means that if you would draw a card and cannot draw a card because your deck is empty, your base takes 3 damage. Which means that theoretically, if you had enough healing, you could survive on 0 deck for the rest of the game. So now that we know the mechanics and we're familiar with the cards, let's talk about actual gameplay and setting up. So to start the game, both players will show your opponents their base and the leaders. Then you'll decide who's going first in a fair random method, such as rock, paper, scissors, or rolling a dice or flipping a coin. Then both players will shuffle their decks and draw their opening 6-card hand. There is a mulligan. You can optionally once shuffle your entire hand back into the deck and then draw a new hand of 6 cards. There are many strategic reasons to take a mulligan, which I might explain in another video later down the line. But once both players are happy with their hands or have taken a mulligan, regardless of whether or not they're happy after the mulligan, both players will then choose 2 cards from their hand and put them face down as resources. This indicates the end of setup phase, and once both players have 2 resources, the first action can be taken by whoever goes first. From there on, they take it in turns to take actions, go through phases, and play until their base reaches 0. So now that I've explained everything, let's take a look at a few turns of gameplay and see how it goes. This will be me playing against a dummy version of myself, but this will just get used to the idea of having actions you can take and going back and forth. So we've got our initial hand, it looks pretty good, there's no need to mulligan, it's got a 1 and a 2 drop, it's got cards we can resource, so let's see how it goes. So we're going to start by resourcing some of our higher cost cards, because we want to be able to keep playing the first few turns of the game, which is obviously very important. And we've still got different options we can take on turn 1. Our opponent will then take 2 resources, and then we decide who goes first on the first initiative. Here I've just chosen myself, because it's me against myself. We'll start by paying 1 cost for the Greedo, who is a 1 cost card, and deploying him as exhausted. From here, it's now our opponent's action. They could play some cards, but they should have mulliganed, so they have nothing to play and will simply take the initiative. We'll then move to the end step, where we'll draw 2 cards, optionally resource 1, which you should probably do in the early stages, and then ready all of your cards. Because our opponent didn't do anything, they just drew 2, resource, and that's it. So, because they have the initiative, they now get to take the first action this turn. They're going to start by paying 1 for a 1 cost chopper that they presumably drew at the end of last turn. Now it's back to our action. We can declare an attack with Greedo perhaps, we could play one of the cards in our hand, we could also use Thrawn's ability. Instead, we'll just take the attack because we're expecting Greedo to go away. So we'll do 3 damage to their enemy base and start pulling up a lead. From there, we go back and forth, taking actions, attacking each other's base until the game ends. And that's it to Star Wars Unlimited! As I've said, I'm really excited for this game, so you can expect to see a lot more content coming up soon. This video was just made for those of you who are interested in the game, who are already watching our content. It's not the best tutorial out there, I know there are other ones, but we'll start working on it very, very soon. The game will be coming out, so we'll be catching along right there with it. Until then, I've been Zystral with Star Wars TCG. As always, please continue to feed the algorithm by doing everything YouTube wants you to do, and hopefully we'll see you all on the next video. Take care, peace out.